2 nights later I returned. I had to see that rain-flooded cellar where every brick was scorched, crumbling, where a few skeletal rafters jabbed at the sky like stakes. Those monstrous murals that had once enclosed the ballroom were blasted fragments in the rubble. A painted face here, a patch of angel's wing there, the only identifiable things that remained. With the evening newspapers, I pushed my way to the back of the crowded little theatre cafe across the street, and there, under the cover of the dim glass lamps and the thick cigarette smoke, I read the accounts of the Holocaust. Few bodies were found in the burnt-out theatre, but clothing and costumes had been scattered everywhere, as though the famous vampire mummers had in fact vacated the theatre in haste long before the fire. In other words, only the younger vampires had left their bones. The ancient ones had suffered total obliteration, no mention of an eyewitness or a surviving victim. How could there have been? Yet something bothered me considerably. I did not fear any vampires who had escaped. I had no desire to hunt them out if they had. That most of the crew had died, I was certain. But why had there been no human guards? I was certain Santiago had mentioned guards, and I'd supposed them to be the ushers and doormen who staffed the theatre before the performance, and I had even been prepared to encounter them with my scythe. But they had not been there. It was strange, and my mind was not entirely comfortable with the strangeness. But finally, when I put the papers aside and sat thinking these things over, the strangeness of it didn't matter. What mattered was that I was more utterly alone in the world than I had ever been in all my life, that Claudia was gone beyond reprieve, and I had less reason to live than I'd ever had, and less desire. And yet my sorrow did not overwhelm me, did not actually visit me, did not make me think of the racked and desperate creature I might have become. Perhaps it was not possible to sustain the torment I'd experienced when I saw Claudia's burnt remains. Perhaps it was not possible to know Perhaps it was not possible to know that and exist over any period of time. I wondered vaguely as the hours passed, as the smoke of the cafe grew thicker, and the faded curtain of the little lamplit stage rose and fell. The robust women sang there, the light glittering on their paste jewels, their rich, soft voices often plaintive, exquisitely sad. I wondered vaguely what it would be to feel this loss, this outrage, and be justified in it, be deserving of sympathy, of solace. I would not have told my woe to a living creature. My own tears meant nothing to me. Where to go, then, if not to die? It was strange how the answer came to me. Strange how I wandered out of the cafe then, circling the ruined theatre, wandering finally towards the broad Avenue Napoleon, and following it towards the Palace of the Louvre. It was as if the place called to me, and yet I had never been inside its walls. I'd passed its long facade 1,000 times, wishing that I could live as a mortal man for one day to move through those many rooms and see those many magnificent paintings. I was bent on it now, possessed only of some vague notion that in the works of art I could find some solace while bringing nothing of death to what was inanimate and yet magnificently possessed of the spirit of life itself. Somewhere along the Avenue Napoleon, I heard the steps behind me which I knew to be Armand's. He was signaling, letting me know that he was near. Yet I did nothing other than slow my pace and let him fall into step with me. And for a long time we walked, saying nothing. I dared not look at him. Of course I'd been thinking of him all the while, and how if we were men and Claudia had been my love, I might have fallen helpless in his arms finally. The need to share some common grief so strong, so consuming. The dam threatened to break now, and yet it did not break. I was numbed, and I walked as one numbed. "You know what I've done," I said finally. We had turned off the avenue, and I could see ahead of me the long row of double columns of the facade of the Royal Museum. You removed your coffin as I warned you. Yes, he answered. There was a sudden, unmistakable comfort in the sound of his voice. It weakened me, but I was simply too remote from pain, too tired. And yet you are here with me now. Do you mean to avenge them? No, he said. They were your fellows. You were their leader, I said. Yet you didn't warn them I was out for them, as I warned you. No, he said. But surely you despise me for it. Surely you respect some rule, some allegiance to your own kind. No, he said softly. It was amazing to me how logical his response was, even though I couldn't explain it or understand it. What? Okay, fine, Louis, we'll go with that. And something came clear to me out of the remote regions of my own relentless considerations. There were guards. There were those ushers who slept in the theater. Why weren't they there when I entered? Why weren't they there to protect the sleeping vampires? Because they were in my employ, and I discharged them. I sent them away, Armand said. I stopped. He showed no concern at my facing him, and as soon as our eyes met, I wished the world were not one black, empty ruin of ashes and death. I wished it were fresh and beautiful, and that we were both living and had love to give each other. You did this, knowing what I planned to do. Yes, he said. But you were their leader. They trusted you. They believed in you. They lived with you, I said. I don't understand you. Why? Think of any answer you like, he said calmly and sensitively, as if he didn't wish to bruise me with an accusation or disdain, but wanted me merely to consider this literally. I can think of many. Think of the one you need and believe it. It's as likely as any other. I shall give you the real reason for what I did, which is the least true. I was leaving Paris. The theater belonged to me, so I discharged them. But with what you knew, I told you, it was the actual reason, and it was the least true, he said patiently. Would you destroy me as easily as you let them be destroyed? I demanded. Why should I? He asked. My God, I whispered. You're much changed, he said, but in a way you are much the same. I walked on for a while, and then, before the entrance of the Louvre, I stopped. At first it seemed to me that its many windows were dark and silver with the moonlight and the thin rain, but then I thought I saw a faint light moving within, as though a guard walked among the many treasures. I envied him completely, and I fixed my thoughts on him obdurately. That guard, calculating how a vampire might get to him, how take his life and his lantern and his keys. I'm not sure about that sense. The plan was confusion. I was incapable of plans. I had made only one real plan in my life, and it was finished. And then finally I surrendered. I turned to Armand again, and let my eyes penetrate his eyes, and let him draw close to me as if he meant to make me his victim. And I bowed my head and felt his firm arm around my shoulder, and remembering suddenly and keenly Claudia's words, what were very nearly her last words, that admission that she knew that I could love Armand because I had been able to love even her, those words struck me as rich and ironical, more filled with meaning than she could ever have guessed. Yes, I said softly to him, that is the crowning evil, that we can go even so far as to love each other, you and I. And who else would show us a particle of love, a particle of compassion or mercy? Who else, knowing us as we know each other, could do anything but destroy us? Yet we love each other. And for a long moment he stood there looking at me, drawing nearer, his head gradually inclining to one side, his lips parted as if he meant to speak, But then he only smiled and shook his head gently to confess he didn't understand. But I wasn't thinking of him anymore. I had one of those rare moments when it seemed I thought of nothing. My mind had no shape. I saw that the rain had stopped. I saw that the air was clear and cold, that the street was luminous, and I wanted to enter the Louvre. I formed words to tell Armand this, to ask him if he might help me do what was necessary to have the Louvre till dawn. He thought it was a very simple request. He said only he wondered why I had waited so long. We left Paris very soon after that. I told Armand that I wanted to return to the Mediterranean, not to Greece as I had so long dreamed. I wanted to go to Egypt. I wanted to see the desert there, and, more importantly, I wanted to see the pyramids and the graves of the kings. I wanted to make contact with those grave thieves who know more of graves than do scholars, and I wanted to go down into the graves yet unopened and see the kings as they were buried, see those furnishings and works of art stored with them, and the paintings on their walls. Armand was more than willing, and we took leave of Paris early one evening by carriage without the slightest hint of ceremony. I had done one thing which I should note. I had gone back to my rooms in the Hotel St. Gabriel. It was my purpose to take up some things of Claudia and Madeleine and put them into coffins and have graves prepared for them in the cemetery of Montmartre. I did not do this. I stayed a short while in the rooms, where all was neat and put right by the staff, so that it seemed Madeleine and Claudia might return at any time. Madeleine's embroidery ring lay with her bundles of thread on a chair-side table. I looked at that and at everything else, and my task seemed meaningless. So I left. But something had occurred to me there, or rather something I had already been aware of merely became clearer. I had gone to the Louvre that night to lay down my soul, to find some transcendent pleasure that would obliterate pain and make me utterly forget even myself. I'd been upheld in this, as I stood on the sidewalk before the doors of the hotel waiting for the carriage that would take me to meet Armand. I saw the people who walked there, the restless boulevard of crowds of well-dressed ladies and gentlemen, the hawkers of papers, the carriers of luggage, the drivers of carriages, all these in a new light. Before, all art had held for me the promise of a deeper understanding of the human heart. Now the human heart meant nothing. I did not denigrate it. I simply forgot it. The magnificent paintings of the Louvre were not for me intimately connected with the hands that had painted them. They were cut loose and dead like children turned to stone. Like Claudia severed from her mother, preserved for decades in pearl and hammered gold. Like Madeleine's dolls. And of course, like Claudia and Madeleine and myself, they could all be reduced to ashes. And that is the end of the story, really. Of course, I know you wonder what happened to us afterwards. What became of Armand? Where did I go? What did I do? But I tell you nothing really happened. Nothing that wasn't merely inevitable. And my journeys through the Louvre that night I've described to you. And my journey through the Louvre that last night I've described to you. That was merely prophetic. I never changed after that. I sought for nothing in the one great source of change which is humanity, and even in my love and absorption with the beauty of the world, I sought to learn nothing that could be given back to humanity. I drank of the beauty of the world as a vampire drinks. I was satisfied. I was filled to the brim. But I was dead, and I was changeless. The story ended in Paris, as I've said. For a long time I thought that Claudia's death had been the cause of the end of things, that if I had seen Madeleine and Claudia leave Paris safely, things might have been different with me and Armand. I might have loved again and desired again, and sought some semblance of mortal life, which would have been rich and varied, though unnatural. But now I have come to see that that was false. Even if Claudia had not died, even if I had not despised Armand for letting her die, it would all have turned out the same. Coming slowly to know his evil, or being catapulted into it, it was all the same. I wanted none of it finally, and deserving nothing better, I closed up like a spider in the flame of a match. And even Armand, who was my constant companion, and my only companion, existed at a great distance from me, beyond the veil which separated me from all living things, a veil which was a form of shroud. But I know you are eager to hear what became of Armand, and the night is almost ended. I want to tell you this because it is very important. The story is incomplete without it. We traveled the world after we left Paris. As I told you, first Egypt, then Greece, then Italy, Asia Minor, wherever I chose to lead us, really, and wherever my pursuit of art led me. Time ceased to exist on any meaningful basis during these years, and I was often absorbed in the very simple things. A painting in a museum, a cathedral window, one single beautiful statue for long periods of time. But all during these years I had a vague but persistent desire to return to New Orleans. I never forgot New Orleans, and when we were in tropical places and places with those flowers and trees that grow in Louisiana, I would think of it acutely, and I would feel for my home the only glimmer of desire I felt for anything outside my endless pursuit of art. And from time to time, Armand would ask me to take him there, and I, being aware in a gentlemanly manner that I did little to please him, and often went for long periods without really speaking to him or seeking him out, wanted to do this because he asked me. It seemed his asking caused me to forget some vague fear that I might feel pain in New Orleans, that I might experience again the pale shadow of my former unhappiness and longing. But I put it off. Perhaps the fear was stronger than I knew. We came to America and lived in New York for a long time. I continued to put it off. Then, finally, Armand urged me in another way. He told me something he'd concealed from me since the time we were in Paris. Lestat had not died in the Theatre des Vampires. I had believed him to be dead, and when I asked Armand about those vampires, he told me they had all perished. But he told me now that this wasn't so. Lestat had left the theatre the night I had run away from Armand and sought out the cemetery in Montmartre. 2 vampires who had been made with Lestat by the same master had assisted him in booking passage to New Orleans. I cannot convey to you the feeling that came over me when I heard this. Of course, Armand told me he had protected me from this knowledge, hoping that I would not undertake a long journey merely for revenge, a journey that would have caused me pain and grief at the time. But I didn't really care. I hadn't thought of Lestat at all the night I'd torched the theatre. I'd thought of Santiago and Celeste and the others who had destroyed Claudia. Lestat, in fact, had aroused in me feelings which I hadn't wished to confide in anyone, feelings I'd wished to forget despite Claudia's death. Hatred had not been one of them. And when I heard this now from Armand, it was as if the veil that protected me were thin and transparent, and though it still hung between me and the world of feeling, I perceived through it Lestat, and that I wanted to see him again, and with that spurring me on, we returned to New Orleans. It was late spring of this year, and as soon as I emerged from the railway station, I knew that I had indeed come home. It was as if the very air were perfumed and peculiar there, and I felt an extraordinary ease walking on those warm, flat pavements under those familiar oaks, and listening to the ceaseless, vibrant, living clouds of the night. Of course, New Orleans was changed, but far from lamenting those changes, I was grateful for what seemed still the same. I could find the uptown garden district, which had been in my time the Faubourg Saint-Marie, one of the stately old mansions that dated back to those times, so removed from the quiet brick streets that walking out in the moonlight under its magnolia trees, I knew the same sweetness and peace I'd known in the old days. Not only in the dark, narrow streets of the Vieux Carré, but in the wilderness of Pointe du Lac. There were the honeysuckle, and the roses, and the glimpses of Corinthian columns against the stars, and outside the gate were dreamy streets, other mansions. It was a citadel of grace. In the Rue Royale, where I took Armand past tourists and antique shops and the bright-lit entrances of fashionable restaurants, I was astonished to discover the town was where Lestat and Claudia and I had made our home. The facade little changed by fresh plaster and whatever repairs had been done within. I was astonished to discover the townhouse. I'll start that again. I was astonished to discover the townhouse where Lestat and Claudia and I had made our home. The facade little changed by fresh plaster and whatever repairs had been done within. Its 2 French windows still opened onto the small balconies over the shop window, and I could see in the soft brilliance of the electric chandeliers an elegant wallpaper that would have not been unfamiliar in those days before the war. I had a strong sense of Lestat there, more of a sense of him than of Claudia, and I felt certain, though he was nowhere near this townhouse, that I'd find him in New Orleans. And I felt something else. It was a sadness that came over me then, after Armand had gone on his way. But this sadness was not painful, nor was it passionate. It was something rich, however, and almost sweet, like the fragrance of the jasmine and the roses that crowded the old courtyard garden which I saw through the iron gates. And this sadness gave a subtle satisfaction and held me a long time in that spot, and it held me to the city, and it didn't really leave me that night when I went away. I wonder now what might have become of this sadness, what it might have engendered in me that could have become stronger, what it might have engendered in me that could have become stronger than itself. But I jump ahead of my story, because shortly after that I saw a vampire in New Orleans. A sleek, white-faced young man walking alone on the broad sidewalks of St. Charles Avenue in the early hours before dawn. And I was at once convinced that if Lestat still lived here, that vampire might know him and might even lead me to him. Of course, the vampire didn't see me. I had long ago learned to spot my own kind in large cities without their having a chance to see me. Armand, in his brief visits with vampires in London and Rome, had learned that the burning of the Théâtre des Vampires was known throughout the world, and that both of us were considered outcasts. Battles over this meant nothing to me, and I have avoided them to this day. But I began to watch for this vampire in New Orleans, and to follow him, though often he led me merely to theatres or other pastimes in which I had no interest. But one night, finally, things changed. It was a very warm evening, and I could tell as soon as I saw him on St. Charles that he had some place to go. He was not only walking fast, but he seemed a little distressed, and when he turned off St. Charles finally on a narrow street which became at once shabby and dark, I felt sure he was headed for something that would interest me. But then he entered one side of a small wooden duplex, and brought death to a woman there. This he did very fast, without a trace of pleasure, and after he was finished, he gathered her child up from the bassinet, wrapped it gently in a blue wool blanket, and came out again into the street. Only a block or two after that, he stopped before a vine-covered iron fence that enclosed a large overgrown yard. I could see an old house beyond the trees, dark with the paint peeling, the ornate iron railings of its long upper and lower galleries caked with orange rust. It seemed a doomed house, stranded here among the numerous small wooden houses, its high empty windows looking out on what must have been a dismal clutter of low roofs, a corner grocery, and a small adjacent bar. But the broad, dark grounds protected the house somewhat from these things, and I had to move along the fence quite a few feet before I finally spotted a faint glimmer in one of the lower windows through the thick branches of the trees. The vampire had gone through the gate. I could hear the baby wailing, and then nothing, and I followed, easily mounting the old fence and dropping down into the garden, and coming up quietly onto the long front porch. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Alright, so we're nearing the end of Interview with the Vampire. What are some of the cool things that went on today? Well, The main thing that is worth discussing regarding our section today is the fact that Louis has completely and finally abandoned his mortal morality. And he has specifically retreated into a comfort of aestheticism. He is shielding himself through aestheticism and allowing himself to avoid caring about the world outside of artistic merit and beauty. He only seems to find art compelling now. He specifically remarks he cares nothing for the people behind it. He has achieved that detachment that he idolized and then denigrated, and now has finally just accepted. This sort of scene in his remark that he drank of the beauty of the world as a vampire drinks, but ultimately he was dead. Dead to the kind of mortal pulse around him, and instead has become this unchanging monolithic force through time that focuses primarily upon artistic beauty and has very little interest in the sufferings or goings on of the people around him. And what this ultimately means in Louis' retreat into aestheticism, he is also retreating into total selfishness. All that matters to Louis now is his own pleasure. All that matters is the things which give him enjoyment, which give him which give him pleasure. He doesn't really care about anyone anymore. And in this, he has succeeded in overcoming his internal conflict. He is no longer conflicted about his actions and his decisions. But I think he went the wrong way. Instead of no longer being a bad person, he now simply no longer cares that he's a bad person. He's accepted his bad personness and just wants to get on with it and thinks, well, this is the way of the world, this is the way I am. All that matters is art. It doesn't matter that, I kill people because nothing means anything. So in the end, it all, comes up to naught. This is the end of Louis' death spiral, I think. I've been talking about this death spiral and how it is progressing more and more as the novel comes to its climax and close, but now he's at the bottom. Louis has fully, completely, and utterly accepted his vampirism at this stage. And not only has he accepted it, but he's gotten quite good at it. He's able to stalk the vampires in the street without being seen. He's able to go from place to place freely. He's able to kill without concern. He's gotten very good at being this idealized vampire figure that he has longed to be, really, as hinted to by his conversation with Lestat, where he said that he wanted to be able to not care about these things. And this new attitude, this final phase in the this end of the death spiral, is justified in terms of this kind of nihilistic transience of existence. The fact that everything around him, people, art, himself, can be reduced to ashes and leave existence, and therefore nothing means anything because there is no higher purpose to the universe. And I've talked about this a lot over the course of this text. And my opinion on, Louis' attitude that nothing means anything. But for Louis, in this moment, his conclusion is nothing means anything. Therefore, it doesn't matter, and I should instead just focus on this higher concept of artistic beauty. And what that really means is his own pleasure. His aestheticism is a crypto-egoism, really, I think. He's just retreated completely into his own ego, and he just wants to go for his own pleasure at every opportunity. And on the subject of Louis actually becoming good at being a vampire now, and becoming the ideal vampire, there's a distinct shift in Louis's behavior which we can notice after he retreats into this total selfishness. And that is that if we look at this master-slave dynamic that we've constantly seen with Louis throughout the text, he's reversed. He's no longer the vampiric slave. He is now the vampiric master. He watches other vampires from the shadows, where previously that was something other vampires did to him. And he tells Armand where to go. When he and Armand are traveling the world together, it is not Armand that dictates the travel, as has happened before with Lestat and Claudia. Instead, Louis is now in charge of Armand, and he tells Armand where they are going. Armand appears to have become a dependent upon Louis. Armand appears to have become Louis's slave, as opposed to the other way around. Armand's fascination and obsession with Louis has grown into a dependence, and Louis has reached the appropriate degree of heartlessness where he is now able to manipulate and take advantage of that for his own benefit. The cycle of abuse is complete. Louis has become Lestat. Louis is now behaving as Lestat behaved, fully and completely, and not with direct intent, but without caring about intent. He doesn't care anymore. He just does what is beneficial to himself. Or whatever achieves the highest artistic beauty, which is just a nonsense way to say what is best for yourself. It's crypto-egoism, in my view. And he has this moment where he kind of falls into brief fascination with Armand again, but he very quickly realizes that he is disgusted by Armand's evil and does not like Armand whatsoever. There's a couple of things in this. The first is that Louis is disgusted by Armand's evil, but takes no concern with his own evil. I think this is indicative of Louis's selfishness, but also Louis's hypocrisy, I suppose. Because in the same kind of theme of mirroring that occurs, we can see the change that's occurred in Louis's character, because when he sees his own evil mirrored in Armand, he is no longer disgusted at himself. He is instead disgusted at Armand. Louis has fully accepted his own evil, but the degree of selfishness which he is, showing off, the degree of just pure self-centered aestheticism and narcissism that he has embraced, means that he doesn't care, and he just doesn't like Armand. He doesn't worry about his own actions. That's a potential reading of that. I think is one of the things I really consider to be quite likely in this scenario. But another thing that I think is quite likely is that even though Louis is disgusted with Armand, his degree of acceptance of this vampiric master-slave dynamic, his mimicking of Lestat's earlier behavior, forces him to still keep Armand around because he finds Armand useful. Armand is a useful source of information. He's someone to have there, someone to help with traveling, probably quite financially useful. I imagine Armand isn't particularly poor. And like Louis himself remarks, that he only really talked to Armand when he needed him. He would go months at a time without talking to him. I think it was months at a time, but long periods of time without talking to Armand, clearly showing that he is not at all really invested in Armand as a person. He's mainly invested in Armand in terms of what Armand can give him, because Louis has now fully become a parasitic vampire in the same way that Lestat and Armand and Claudia used to be. And interestingly, on the subject of Lestat, when Armand gives Louis the bit of information that Lestat was not in the theatre when he burnt it down, and that Lestat is more than likely still alive, Louis immediately wants to go and see Lestat for himself. He wants to go and meet Lestat. And this implies a few things, I think. The first is kind of an indication that Louis isn't completely over Lestat. This notion that perhaps the vampiric master-slave dynamic is somewhat malleable and transient, where vampires can move from one state to the other. We've already seen Armand go from a master to a slave, and perhaps Louis could then go from a slave to a master back to a slave, because he desires Lestat. However, I think there's also a degree here of fascination, because the way Louis talks about Lestat is not in the same level of obsession that he did prior. It's much more a curiosity, a fascination. He doesn't seem to care as much anymore. He doesn't even care to the point of hating him. He's that kind of quote-unquote detached. Except he's literally detached now. I shouldn't say quote-unquote. Louis is literally detached now, as opposed to the quote-unquote detached he was the first time he was claiming he was detached. And potentially what going to see Lestat is a desire for some element of closure on Louis's part. He kind of just wants to close that chapter, find out how it ends, go and see him for one last time so that he can, leave him in the dust and head off. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops, because when they arrive in New Orleans, Louis notices that Lestat appears to have made another vampiric servant for himself. A young man, as can be expected. We've talked about Lestat's particular taste in young men and the implications of that prior. But I suppose one of the interesting things here is that the young man appears to be bringing a baby to Lestat for him to presumably feed on. And what are the implications to be found in this? Well, we'll see as we go into the sort of home stretch here, the last few pages of this book. And also, how are we going to see Louis react when he sees Lestat again after all this time? Is Louis going to revert to his former slave state? Or is Louis going to maintain his master dynamic? Perhaps Louis will even be able to subjugate Lestat himself. The only thing we can say for certain here is that Louis has chosen to abandon his mortal moral principles. He no longer holds human values dear within him. He no longer seeks to do the right thing. He merely seeks to do that which benefits himself the most. And I must stress yet again, this is not because he has been made to do these things. It is through his own choices in response to the situations that befallen him. Even though Louis has had many bad things happen to him, we can't pretend that the bad things Louis has chosen to do are the result of him not having any choice whatsoever. Louis justifies his evil actions time and time again in terms of not having a choice. And this final retreat into aestheticism is essentially played off as a natural conclusion. Louis remarks that it would have happened no matter what. And we can't buy that. We shouldn't buy Louis when he tells us this, because it implies that there is no moral agency within people. It implies that people cannot be held responsible for their actions, that good cannot be considered to exist, and that we should all just retreat into this nihilistic view of the world where nothing means anything. And whilst that is something you can do, it is clearly not the path to fulfillment or happiness or recognition. It is clearly a path that just leads to destructive behavior, both of those around you and of yourself. So we will see. We'll see how this develops. There's probably going to be 2 more days of reading left in this book. We're very nearly finished, but I hope you stick around. I hope you tune back in tomorrow and listen in for another small section of Interview with the Vampire. I'll see you then.